This is Dan Schneider. This is another American Television with Mitchell Hadley. And this time we're going to do a biography of Mike Wallace. For those who don't know, Mike Wallace was a famous guy long before he ever did 60 Minutes, and Mitch and I are going to talk about it. But before we get into that, for those who don't know Mitch, Mitchell Hadley, could you introduce yourself again?
Glad to, and it's good to be with you again, Dan. I am a classic TV historian, novelist, author on a website about classic TV. It's abouttv.com. I've also written a book of essays about classic TV and its role in American popular culture called The Electronic Mirror, what classic TV tells us about who we were and who we are and everything in between.
So, as I mentioned just briefly, most people who know the name Mike Wallace know, oh, that's the 60 Minutes guy. And for most people watching this, that he's probably, goes back to most people's childhood. There was always a Mike Wallace on television, even before 60 Minutes, though. Who was Mike Wallace? Where did he come from as a child? Do we know?
Well, Mike Wallace, his background was that he was born in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, in a Russian Jewish family. He graduated from the University of Michigan. He was a reporter for the Michigan Daily, so he had some news background from the very beginning. And he got his start, as so many of the people we've talked about did, in radio. Working for the behind the scenes from when he was at the University of Michigan. He appeared as a guest, actually, on the show Information Please in 1939. He went through World War II, came back, and was an announcer for many of the popular radio programs of the time. The Green Hornet, Spike Jones Show. There are some people who will say that he was an announcer on The Lone Ranger. He says that that is not the case. But he was involved in radio. He was a staff announcer for CBS in the late 1940s. And at the end of the decade of the 40s, as television started to develop, he made the transition to TV, partly as a dramatic actor, which may seem odd, although it is not unusual. He used his name Myron Wallace, and he played a detective on a radio series called Crime on the Waterfront. Then he moved into TV and did a similar police drama called Stand By for Crime, and that was also under the name Myron Wallace. But as the 50s progress, he moves in and becomes identified as a game show host. And I think when he first starts to pick up national recognition, that's where it's going to be. I have a TV guide from February of 1957. And in that, they identify him as the innocuous MC of a game show called The Big Surprise. And at that point, he's done some work on To Tell the Truth. In fact, he actually hosted the pilot for To Tell the Truth at the time when it was called Nothing But the Truth. Mm-hmm. And he's done commercials at the same time, too. He's become fairly well known as a commercial spokesman. Now, what we discover in this 1957 article about him is that he wants to do something other than that. He wants to move beyond that. And the way he has done that is through an interview show that's called Night Beat. It's a local program. It airs on WABD in New York City, and it is a forerunner of his later interview show, the Mike Wallace Interview. But it is a very basic very to the point interview program. It's on a blackened set. The only other things there are two chairs and a spotlight. And Wallace and his guest sit down and talk for half an hour. And so it's a very straightforward show, but already, even at this point in time, we're starting to see the trademarks of what Mike Wallace will become known for. He has the habit of making guests increasingly nervous as the interview goes on. He pops these questions in from different directions, questions that they're not necessarily prepared for. There is one story of a nameless author of a best-selling and highly erotic novel. I'm sure that we could find out fairly easily who it was. But his first question to her is the book autobiographical? And then there's another instance where he's interviewing the Arctic explorer, Peter Fruchen. And he has this great quote in the form of a question. He says, "Psychiatrists say that a man who risks his life many times is not a brave man, but one who doubts his own manhood. Does this apply to you?" So already we can see the Mike Wallace that we've all come to know and love. But it's very interesting to see it early on when he is still primarily identified as a commercial spokesman or game show host, that he already had this edge, already the trappings of the fame that he would develop as an interviewer in news shows.
Well, let's just backtrack to some of the things, because that was quite a lengthy intro here. You mentioned something called Information Please, a radio show. Is that related to the current Information Please Almanac?
Yes, it is. That is, in fact, where the almanac got its name.
Ah, okay. Now, just looking over, he served in World War II in the South Pacific, just like the next person we're going to speak of after this show. And it looks like he was a communications officer. He was in charge of supplies on a submarine. So he never really saw action in terms of wielding a gun or whatnot. It seems like he was always an observer. It's interesting, though, how soon did he give up on acting? Because acting is about observing, but it's also about participating, whereas journalism is basically stepping back from participation, hopefully.
Right. Well, I think that as far as acting in the sense that he is playing a role, I think we can probably see him as bowing out of that around 1949, 1950. If you extend acting into the realm of being a commercial spokesman, even though he may be playing himself, he may not be, but he may be. And if you include that in the sense of acting, then he does that throughout the 1950s.
Did he ever study journalism, actually?
Well, I don't know that he formally studied journalism. His degree is just, what I read was that it was just described as a Bachelor of Arts degree. But I think the fact that he worked as a reporter for the Michigan Daily suggests that even if he didn't have formal education as a journalist, he certainly had started to acquire a background in journalism, and that indicates that he was interested in it from a very early time.
So you mentioned how, aside from game show hosting and announcing, he was also on the payroll of, it seems, Philip Morris as a huckster for cigarettes. And I'm just wondering, do we know anything about how long he was there, why he parted ways with them? Because as a 60 Minutes correspondent, he pretty famously was very distrustful of corporations.
Yes. I believe that his relationship with Philip Morris comes from their sponsorship of his interview programs, particularly the Mike Wallace interview, where he's always seen with a cigarette. For example, when he's interviewing Rod Serling. You can almost see a haze around the set the entire time of the interview. But of course, the clips that we have of his shows generally have the commercials edited, so we haven't seen his commercials in the Mike Wallace interview, but the prominence of the cigarette during the show itself leads me to believe that he's fairly prominent in advertising it during the commercial breaks. And I think his relationship with them continues as a result of that. So that actually goes through the early 1960s. That, in fact, is his primary source of income at that point. We'll touch on this as we go along, but he hosts a number of other shows getting up into the early 1960s when he goes to CBS. And so during that time period before he establishes himself at the network, that's his primary source of income, is doing these cigarette commercials for, I think it was Parliament that he advertised.
I know that as a kid, the public television in the early 70s, often the last thing they would do would rerun 2 or 3 nights a week some of the old Mike Wallace interviews, because I believe when Wallace was doing his interviews, the station later became a public television station, but that public television station, when it was a commercial station in the 50s, still owned the rights to that show. And I remember watching
WABD.
Yeah, I remember watching those interviews and seeing people like a Serling. I think Norman Mailer probably appeared once or twice on there.
Ayn Rand,
Truman Capote might have been on there too, if I recall. And the interesting thing is, he seems to have been a sort of bridge, because before that you had Edward R. Murrow, and Murrow, didn't do. I mean, he did more puff pieces, even though he has a reputation as a hard journalist. Wallace was Wallace was harder edge, and then by the late 60s, once he fades away from his own show and then gets involved in 60 Minutes, you have guys like Phil Donahue, William F. Buckley, David Susskind that sort of take over. What led to the demise of him having his own just interview show? Was it ratings or?
Well, I think that there are a couple of controversies that, if they didn't directly lead to the end of the show, I think they certainly played a major role in it. He has a propensity for tackling controversial issues, and he, like Susskind, will have anybody on the show that he considers interesting. And so they have a lineup of guests that somebody described once as running the gamut from fascists, communists, racists, gangsters, and little-known intellectuals with unusual and provocative ideas. So you had kind of a tinderbox of topic right there. He had the gangster Mickey Cohen on one show, and during the show, Cohen, as they said, cheerfully libeled an entire group of West Coast police officers. So ABC leaned on him to tone things down after that. Then he had a show with, I believe it was Drew Pearson, who is one of the most well-known political columnists in the country. And during the show, Pearson just casually happens to mention, oh, by the way, John F. Kennedy didn't write Profiles in Courage. It was all ghostwritten for him by Ted Sorensen. And they go into that for a couple of minutes. And, of course, Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, is furious about all of this. He contacts ABC. He demands an apology from Drew Pearson. He demands an apology from Mike Wallace. He finally gets it, the discretion being the better part of valor. But I suspect that led the network to look at Wallace and think that he was probably more trouble than he was worth. And so he moves on to other projects from that. He was the host of a late night show, a variety and talk show called PM. And it was part of a a doublet of shows called AM and PM. AM came from the East Coast, PM came from the West Coast, and he was one of the co-hosts of PM. So that is much more of the entertainment softcore Wallace than what we would come on to see. That ends. Then he moves on, probably one of his best known jobs outside of working on 60 Minutes. Wallace is he's trying actually to rehabilitate his image. He's trying to transition from being the game show host, the enfant terrible, to a serious newsman, somebody who's not trying to necessarily be provocative, but who is trying to be taken seriously as a newsman. The Mike Wallace interviews, if you look back at them, many of them are excellent. We would consider them very hard news today, but at the time, there certainly was a trace of, I don't want to say Jerry Springer or anything like that, because they weren't sensational. There was no studio audience. There was nothing like that, but he dealt with sensationalist topics. So I think he was trying to get back to establishing himself as someone who could be taken seriously in journalism. And that's where he joined up to do biography. He was the host of the David Wolper half-hour syndicated show Biography. And people probably remember that mostly from the reruns they would show on A&E in the 80s and early 90s. But this was a very successful program. Wallace had a great voice and a great demeanor to be a narrator of these films. He wasn't an active participant in it otherwise. And so I think that's where he starts on his road to rehabilitation. Biography wins a Peabody Award. It's one of the highest rated shows of its kind in the country. And now Mike Wallace is hot property again. And that's when CBS comes calling.
Now, one of the things I do want to point out before we get into the 60 Minutes stuff is I remember on a number of the shows, and you mentioned a couple of quips that he made. He was quick-witted, but oftentimes when he interviewed people like, I think, a Helen Gurley Brown or some of the other, what were then called women's liber types, or women in general, he would sometimes make what would now be considered condescending remarks, and posthumously, it came out, there was sort of a scandal that not only he, but several other bigwigs at 60 Minutes during the 60s and 70s were a touchy-feely bunch. So none of this came out for 40 years or more.
No.
How do you think that has affected sort of what we look at? And I wonder if some of his, because he seemed to do something for 2 or 3 years for about 15, 20-year period and then move on. And it's not like like we said, he was good and he was provocative, but I'm wondering if does anyone know if there were any, was he caught fondling, one of the girls?
Somebody probably knows whether or not that affected his job security at any of these shows. He was pretty upfront about it when he did talk about it. In retrospect, he talked about how he used to put his hand on the backs of female coworkers and unsnap the clasps on their bras. And he said it wasn't a secret. I've done that. And that was in 1991 when he made that admission. So he didn't try to cover it up. And I don't know if that had anything to do, or if it did, how much it did. Certainly that kind of behavior was more accepted, if not acceptable, back in the 50s and 60s. So if it was going on, if we were seeing a pattern of that kind of behavior, I don't know that it would have by itself been a liability for him. I think that if you take it in combination with some other personality traits that he might have asserted, such as wanting control over his show, such as being resistant to apologizing for the content of some of them, like the interview about, or the comment about Kennedy not writing profiles in courage. I think that it probably made it easier to consider him somebody who was more trouble than he was worth.
So 60 Minutes has a reputation not only as hard-hitting journalism, but it was also considered vanguard in being a TV news magazine, although it actually wasn't the first. I believe NBC had Monitor back in the late 50s,
Yes.
and a handful of other ones, but they all seemed to just last a year or two and run out of steam. But for some reason, 60 Minutes, the first 4 or 5 years, it could have been canceled. But by 72, 73, once Watergate hit, I guess, that was it. It took off into the stratosphere for the next 30 plus years. I don't know how it's doing now in the ratings, but so how did it come about with Don Hewitt, the creator, and how did Wallace become involved?
Okay. Well, after the success of Biography, as I had mentioned, he was a hot property again, and CBS came to him with an offer for what he wanted, which was to be considered a serious journalist. So he was described as being more obedient. I think that was the word one of his colleagues said. Watching Mike on the air today is like watching a lion obediently padding down Madison Avenue. His first major position at CBS was as the anchor of the CBS Morning News. And there you see Wallace's impact in helping the transition from the morning news, which at the time he took it over was, or had very shortly before, been just a 15-minute program. And it was really just kind of a warm-up for Captain Kangaroo, the children's show that CBS showed during the mornings. The CBS Morning News, as he expanded it, came to be more like a morning version of Cronkite's evening news. And it expanded to 25 minutes with another 5 minutes where the local stations could do their own newscast. It expanded from that into a full hour, again, with the local stations coming in. But it became the news, the hard news alternative to a program like the Today Show on NBC. So Wallace is with that for a few years before he hands the reins over to Joe Benty. And Wallace is from there able to get into some more hard-hitting journalism. He is a political reporter, becomes very prominent, has a run-in with the police at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. It's not as celebrated as his colleague Dan Rather's run-in, but it's there nonetheless. Wallace is all over the floor. He's being very intrusive, which you have to be if you're going to be a successful floor reporter at a national convention. He's doing serious reports on everything from politics to the civil rights movement. He's becoming a featured person on the CBS News. There's a very funny story about him that Joe Benty told me when I was talking to him about the TV coverage of the Robert F. Kennedy assassination. Benty was the lead anchor on the initial coverage of the assassination because it had happened in the middle of the night. And so Benty was the first on the air for CBS, and he was the anchor through the first few hours. And he said that if you watch the early coverage, and you can see it, he says, you'll always see Wallace when he comes in to report on something, standing over my shoulder, bending down, trying to force himself into the picture as much as possible. So even at that point, Wallace is understanding certainly that there is a bit of self-promotion involved in all of this. But to 60 Minutes, it's very interesting to watch the early episodes of 60 Minutes, because you see that it is not a weekly program. It's actually every other week. And it is not on Sunday nights. It's on Tuesdays, it's on Fridays, it's on different nights of the week. It's just presented in TV Guide as a special. And he co-hosts with Harry Reasoner. And Reasoner introduces the show as our attempt to put a magazine on television, to use the elements of a magazine in a television program. So they're presenting it as a fairly revolutionary idea for TV. To a certain extent, that's true. Monitor was primarily a radio program, so it never made any kind of a substantial television presence in the way that 60 Minutes did. But 60 Minutes with Wallace and Reasoner is a show that begins to evolve to covering very hard news, things that you don't often see on television or don't have presented in long periods of time. He has an interview, for instance, while he's still on the CBS Morning News, he has an interview with Malcolm X. And during the interview, Malcolm X mentions that he's probably already a dead man. And sure enough, he's assassinated a few months later. Wallace is one of the first people to bring Louis Farrakhan from the Nation of Islam into the national spotlight by interviewing him on the program and talking about how Islam, the Nation of Islam, was a form of hate generated by hate. So 60 Minutes is creating a provocative image even from there. And it continues to cover topical news stories and these features as well. And I know we'll probably get to this, but through the years, the centerpiece of 60 Minutes becomes Mike Wallace interviewing somebody. Mike Wallace ready to spring the gotcha. Mike Wallace going behind the scenes to, this is the man that they can't BS, they can't stonewall, they can't turn him away. It's Mike Wallace.
So there's a couple of points regarding the show that need to be addressed, things that have fallen into sort of the cultural mythos. The biggest one was the ego battles. You mentioned Mike Wallace getting the big interviews, and he basically emerges as the cock of the walk early on in the show. Reasoner is there for another 15, 20 years, whatever it is. I don't know if he died.
Reasoner does have a fairly significant spell when he jumps ship and goes to ABC to anchor the evening news over there. And so when Reasoner leaves, it's Morley Safer and Dan Rather, who become the other major figures of 60 Minutes at that point.
And then later Ed Bradley, Diane Sawyer in the early 80s. But famously, a lot of people have said that there was a lot of friction first between Reasoner and Wallace, since Reasoner was a journalist. He had his credentials, and Wallace was, I guess, looked at as the celebrity interview guy. Dan Rather, for all his faults, also was a journalist, and Morley Safer as well. So what was the relationship between sort of that core early group, and how did Wallace become the man most associated with that? I mean, yes, Rather became the news anchor, but when people think of 60 Minutes, boom, you see Wallace.
Yeah, exactly. I think that part of that comes from the fact that, Wallace's role on 60 Minutes in the first place was because he was seen as kind of a contrast to Reasoner. So they wanted to be able to balance out the personalities on the show. They wanted to balance stories that were important nationally with stories that weren't getting the kind of time that they could get on the evening news, that they'd be able to show around 13 to 15 minutes long. And I think that I'm speculating here again. I think that part of the focus on Wallace was that Rather had become such a lightning rod for controversy during the Nixon administration that I think the network may have been reluctant to give him a higher profile on 60 Minutes just because of the controversy that it would cause. When Morley Safer joins 60 Minutes, he's playing Harry Reasoner. So Morley Safer is doing the less aggressive types of stories, more of the backgrounds, the profiles, things like that, while Wallace is more specifically doing the aggressive stories, the stories that have conflict in them or controversy or are calling for investigative reporting. And I think that as they add more personalities to the program, and as the relationship between the media and the establishment politicians becomes more contentious, not just Nixon, but from Nixon on, as there becomes more of that adversarial relationship, all of them start doing more hard-hitting investigative work. But having had that from the beginning, Wallace just becomes the expert in that.
Yeah, and he not only on the political side, but also, as I mentioned earlier, on the corporate side. In the 1970s, it was said the most terrifying words a rich person can hear is that Mike Wallace is here to interview.
Yeah, there's a wonderful cartoon that I've cut out and saved, and it shows George Washington sitting behind his desk in the Oval Office, which of course he never sat in. It didn't exist then, but George Washington is sitting there in all of his presidential glory, and one of his aides comes into him and says, "Sir, there's a Mike Wallace here to talk to you about a cherry tree." And that kind of sums up Mike Wallace in a nutshell. I remember an expert in public relations and interviews talking about why Wallace carried so much power and so much sway in these interviews. And she was saying that you have to understand the average corporate CEO has a huge ego to begin with. They wouldn't be where they are otherwise. So they have supreme confidence in themselves. And if they find out that they are a target of a Mike Wallace story, either an interview or a profile or anything like that, their own personal sense of machismo kicks in, and they think they can best Mike Wallace. So they are ready to go in and confront Wallace, and it turns into sort of a boxing match. And as people who watch boxing can tell you, if you come into a fight too aggressively, swinging, going for the knockout punch, trying to prove something, you generally leave yourself wide open to some kind of counterpunch. And that's what happens so often in these, that the executives, the personalities who had the greatest confidence in their own ability wind up leaving themselves open to a barrage of questions from Wallace that they're not able to answer. And then on the flip side, you have people who are terrified by Wallace. They're intimidated by him before the interview even begins. And those are people that he's just able to chop to pieces if he chooses to, or he can lull them into a false sense of security. This is something he's been very good at for a long time through all of his interviews on television. And so either way you look at it, whether you are afraid of him or whether you want to challenge him, you are by and large running into somebody who is not going to let you get that advantage. And there are so many examples of it that I think it would almost become a sport where people would tune in just to see what he was able to do on the interview shows that night. The commercials would often be something along the lines of, you want to know what's going on with your taxpayer dollars. Government officials won't tell you. Find out what happens when they try to stonewall Mike Wallace tonight on 60 Minutes. So there was this whole aura about him that is really quite exceptional. And the fact that he was able to live up to it for so long as well.
I know by the late 70s or early 80s, a lot of people that were supposed to be interviewed, they'd be preparing their story, and people would back out, and you'd see people walking away and shutting doors on the 60 Minutes crew, and that became almost a cultural meme in itself.
Gotcha journalism of a sense.
I think it was a meat packers plant was the first one that might have done it in the 70s, and then it just sort of like, we're not going to talk to you.
Yeah, that was this technique of showing up at a headquarters or a company with camera crew in tow. So if they don't let you in, it's going to be on TV. If they turn you away, if they run, all of it's going to be on film. And that becomes a tremendously impressive sight on TV. And by impressive, I don't necessarily mean good or bad, but it makes an impression on people when they're seeing this. It's, as they say on Perry Mason, in the state of California, flight can be used as evidence of guilt. And this is what happened in these cases as well. It almost became that your refusal to talk to the reporters, whether it be Wallace or somebody else, your refusal to have them in, your refusal to stick around, that became almost an admission of guilt, rightly or wrongly.
Then there was the William Westmoreland general, where he claimed to have been libeled by a story that Wallace and 60 Minutes did. I think they even dramatized that in a movie later, years later.
Yeah. Wallace generally does not come out well in some of these cases. Anything where they have dramatized it, whether it is the Westmoreland case or later on the tobacco case, Wallace tends not to show in the best of light that way. And I'm not sure whether that's an entirely accurate portrayal or if it is more of a dramatic license that the writers are taking. But you're correct. Wallace and CBS got into a great deal of trouble with Westmoreland, and that became a cause célèbre within conservative political circles to support Westmoreland in his efforts to show that CBS and Mike Wallace had deliberately set out to slander him or to libel him and to take down his reputation, to question his competence during the Vietnam War. Now, all of this is kind of ironic because when Richard Nixon had been elected president in 1968, his first choice for press secretary was Wallace. He asked Mike Wallace to serve as his press secretary. Wallace seriously considered it before he turned it down. So, and Wallace had relatively good relations with many Republicans, not just Nixon, but Ron and Nancy Reagan had been longtime friends. He had always seen himself as being middle of the road, nonpartisan rather than bipartisan. So it's kind of ironic that he gets into the middle of this huge controversy with Westmoreland. But ultimately, what happens is that CBS and Wallace settle with Westmoreland. Each side agrees to pay their own legal fees and court costs. And CBS goes on and says, look, we were not intending to slander or demean Westmoreland. We were doing a report on what was going on. our intent was never to do a hit piece on him. So if it came out that way, that wasn't what we were trying to do.
So the show actually becomes number one for a handful of years, probably 4 or 5 years, spread over about a 10-year period from the
Mm-hmm.
70s and 80s. And it spawns a lot of imitators,
Yeah.
most famously 2020, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But none of these shows seems to have a Wallace character. There isn't a
No.
hard, Barbara Walters, who we've done before.
Mm-hmm.
She isn't a Mike Wallace. Any of the failed NBC attempts, including a revived Monitor,
Mm-hmm.
fail.
Yeah.
He's in some ways he gets this reputation of being nonpareil, and I think a lot of that, from what I've read here and there in magazines over the years, was that Wallace took the lion's share of the credit for it being number one. He
Mm-hmm.
felt because he was the most identified that it was, sort of like Mike Wallace and Friends.
Yeah, well, and you had asked earlier about the interpersonal relationships on 60 Minutes, and certainly there was a feeling. I don't know how strong it was, but there was a feeling among the staff there, the people who would do a lot of the pre-work, that they would do the initial interviews, they would do all the research, they would do the hard work, and then at the end, Wallace would swoop in when the camera was turned on, and he would be the one who would appear on the interviews or the profiles. He is the one who'd get all the credit, but in fact, most of his work had been done for him previously. Now, you can make that argument, and that's a good argument to make. And you could argue that Wallace might have been more generous with credit for the people that he worked with. But on the other hand, you can also make the argument that um, every script, every piece of research, whether it's for an acting role or a script for a news program or a speech for a politician, every writer's job depends on the success of the person who is delivering that content. And you can see that for all of the work that these people did, which is not insignificant, that work may not have accomplished a tenth of the impact that it did were it not for Wallace's performance on the air. His delivery, his demeanor, the way that he's able to spring these traps on people or get down to the bottom of things and get the information. So there are two sides to that kind of argument. But I think that points exactly to what you're talking about. The only newsman I can think of two news people that you might conceivably have wanted to try to make into a Mike Wallace. One of them is Tom Snyder, and this goes way back. And Snyder was more of an anchorman, perhaps, but Snyder, through his work in local TV and radio, and then through hosting the Tomorrow Show on NBC, was a very good interviewer. He had a lot of experience in not only interviewing people, but taking contentious people. He wasn't afraid to challenge somebody on air. He wasn't afraid to go to the mat with them over a particular question. So someone like Snyder might well have been able to do a show like that. Now, he would not have been the good guy that Wallace always managed to portray himself as. Snyder would have been the man in the black hat. And I don't know that the network would have gone for that, but Snyder might have been effective. The other personality that you look at is Charlie, the interviewer on CBS.
Oh, Charlie Rose.
Yes, Charlie Rose was probably the only other television personality that had the credibility as an interviewer that Wallace did, being able to do multiple kinds of interviews, in-depth interviews that weren't necessarily self-promoting. But the problem with Rose was that he was not the kind of outgoing, confrontational, soundbite type of interviewer that Wallace was. So he wouldn't have produced the spectacular kinds of scenes that Wallace was able to do. Ideally, I suppose what you were looking for is a combination of Snyder and Rose, and you might have had something there. But on any of the other networks, including CBS, in the other shows they've tried, there never has really been anybody that could quite compare
Yeah.
with Wallace.
Yeah, I think to me Snyder is more on the line of David Susskind in that he was more
Mm-hmm.
sort of a second generation in that. And Charlie Rose, well, I think he was good with the arts in general, but
Yeah.
but of course then we know what happened with him during
Mm-hmm.
the Me
Yes,
Too
speaking
stuff.
of,
He
yes.
made Mike Wallace look like a
Fighter.
Cub Scout. But segueing from that though.
Mhm.
There was also with Wallace, there were accusations of racism for off-color remarks that he's made over the years. Most famously, was some with hot mics where he was heard making fun of blacks and Latinos. He made some indelicate remarks about Jews and slavery, and of course, then there was always rumors that he didn't get along with Ed Bradley, the lone black. Or the first black correspondent there, and Diane Sawyer, who was she the first female on the show?
I think she probably was,
Okay.
yes.
So it seems that Wallace every so often would bubble up his own personal issues with sex or race or whatever.
Yeah, he was. There's no question Wallace has an ego. I think that we can see that pretty clearly in everything that we've been talking about. And he has an intemperate side to him. I know the comments that you were referring to about blacks and Jews, particularly the one about blacks, is really wince-inducing. I don't want to go into it other than to say that it involves watermelon in some respect. So this is something that you would think that a journalist as smart as Wallace, as experienced as Wallace, would know better than to do something like that. It's precisely the kind of trap he would have sprung on somebody else. And so I don't know how you explain things like that, except that he a sense of his own sense of hubris or confidence or a swagger. No, he was, during a lot of this time, he was also suffering from undiagnosed clinical depression. He'd attempted suicide. He had had a number of issues that had required hospitalization on his part, and then therapy. And he even responds to that in a typical way, that although he undergoes the therapy and he sees a psychiatrist and he is treated successfully, it would appear, even through all of that, he doesn't want to talk about it because it would kind of it would be seen as an expression of weakness. Now that's very typical of the time. It's certainly not exclusive just to Wallace, but it kind of plays in again to this machismo type of thing that we've talked about. And so I think all of this is perhaps of akin. If you go all the way back to Wallace in the Mike Wallace interviews, and you see that his difficulties with authority there, and his difficulties with other shows, and his difficulties with some of his relationships at CBS, I think you can see it as all perhaps of a kind. And so I guess I'm not surprised by any of it, is what I'm saying. But it presents him as a far more complicated and multifaceted person than you might think at first.
So he works into his 90s, and I think even up until maybe a month or two before he actually dies. His most famous offspring is Chris Wallace, formerly of Fox, and now I think is Chris Wallace on CBS now. I'm not certain.
He might be,
Or
yeah.
CNN.
One
of the two.
The CNN gig didn't work out so well, so he might be at CBS now.
So what are we looking at legacy, and what is Mike Wallace's place within certainly 20th to early 20th century? I'd say it's overall a plus, but what is your assessment of his place and import in this medium?
I think that as far as Mike Wallace, the man, is concerned, you can say that he was a man who could be difficult, who could be problematic, who perhaps was not as generous with his colleagues as he could have been, and not as easy to work with as he could have been, and who was guilty of some of the faults that he would gladly have exploited in other people. Nonetheless, I think he was a proud man who took a great deal of pride, much of it rightfully so, for the work that he did. And I think that he was very conscientious about the efforts that he made. He may not have always been conscientious about the reporting, ask William Westmoreland, but I think that he was aware of a certain standard of performance that he had to live up to. His legacy as Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes, and that we'll just use that as a blanket for everything that he's done. As the journalist, the interviewer, I think his legacy is enormous. It is that of a man who brought to television the kind of bulldog journalism that you might have seen only on newspapers or magazines, other kinds of print publications. Part of that is because of 60 Minutes, because it gave him the opportunity to explore things in much greater depth than TV news was generally used to devoting, unless it would be an hour-long special that a lot of people wouldn't see. But more than that, I think he presents the ideal of what television journalism can accomplish, what we should be asking it to accomplish, which is to act as something of a public watchdog, to try to dig out the truth, to try to get behind the official facade, to act as sort of an ombudsman for the public in terms of dealings that the public has with the government, with big business, with other kinds of industries. I think it would have been very interesting to see the Mike Wallace of the 80s during the COVID crisis, and to see if he had chosen to look at the role of Big Pharma in the vaccine rollout and everything subsequent to that, the kinds of things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has talked about. I don't know whether Wallace would have gotten involved in that, but it would have been very, very interesting if he had. And I think what we're saying here is that he's the only television journalist, perhaps, who would have been of the stature that he could have dived into something like that and been respected by viewers for what he came up with. So I think his legacy is a huge one. It is not a spotless one. It has some flaws and some black marks to it, as most people will for having spent the amount of time in the media that he did. But I think that he accomplished tremendous things. He became a legend within his own working time, not just his lifetime, but his own working time. He became an icon. His name became synonymous, as you said. Mike Wallace is in the waiting room. There aren't many people who can achieve that in their own lifetime, let alone while they're actually doing that job. And so for that reason, I think that Wallace does and should occupy a major section in the story of the late 20th and early 21st century broadcast journalism.
And certainly with Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, he's one of the big three of CBS News history.
It's a tragedy to see what has happened to CBS in the years since. This is off topic, but just to say that the instability that they have had at in the top jobs and everything, when you look at what CBS had come to stand for, and Wallace was no little part of that, it's sad to see what has become of that since, perhaps inevitable, but sad nonetheless.
Well, we'll leave it there, and we'll come back with our next interview about Rod Serling in a bit.
Submitted for your approval.